Israel dwelling in safety? What does Ezekiel really mean? And you will absolutely be forgiven for thinking, not another Ezekiel 38 talk. But hopefully as we go through it, you'll see that we're really going to zoom in on one small aspect of Ezekiel 38, which I think is really interesting. Now, just a quick bit of backstory about this study. I first gave this in early 2021 in my home ecclesia, which is Punchbowl in Sydney. And then I more recently gave this talk in May of this year at an Oldies Week. And that will be relevant later on, why I mention that, because a fair bit has changed. Well, a lot has happened since I first gave the talk, but nothing has changed. So here's an outline of what we are looking to cover. So this is what we're aiming to cover in our next sort of 45 minutes or so. So we're going to kick off and remind ourselves about the idea of dwelling safely in the land. Like, where is that in the Bible? Why is that so important, particularly to the Jews? We're going to look at a few important facts from Ezekiel 38 to just zoom out and get a sort of understanding at a superficial level of the key facts, even though we're probably all super familiar with it. Then we're going to dive in and look at some of Israel's history of peace treaties, as well as their history of conflicts, because if we're going to be thinking about Israel dwelling in safety, we have to sort of ask, has that happened before? What might it have looked like? And what's been their history? And when I talk about history, I'm talking about modern history, so sort of 1948 onwards. Then we'll come back to our key passage in Ezekiel 38, and we'll understand what Ezekiel is seemingly talking about when he says they're dwelling safely. We're going to look up a few passages in that time, so please have your Bibles out. It's a prophecy talk, so we've got to be getting deep into our Bibles. And then we're going to wrap up with a little current events snapshot. So back in 2021, at the end of the study, I had a few things to watch. They were not predictions because, as Cyril Tennant says, the purpose of Bible prophecy is not to predict the future, but to recognise the signs when they appear. I love that quote, and I've got it written in bold above Ezekiel 38. But there were some things to sort of watch for that I thought might be interesting to keep an eye on back in about April 2021. And I think it's interesting revisiting those and seeing what's happened since then. And I did that in May for the Oldies Week, and then even more has happened. So it's sort of a topic that's hard to keep up with, as you can imagine. And so we'll wrap up by looking at those things and sort of deciding where Israel are today. So let's kick off, get our Bibles open, and we're going to look at this idea just briefly of dwelling safely in the land. So the first place we find that is Leviticus 25, if you want to turn over there briefly. Now, all of my quotes, unless otherwise, are from the King James. I haven't put any of them on the screen because I love it when we turn up our Bibles. It'll keep us all awake. So Leviticus 25, verse 18 and 19, we see the idea that dwelling in the land is linked to their behaviour. So it is the positive outcome of their behaviour. Verse 18, wherefore ye shall do my statutes and keep my judgments and do them, and ye shall dwell in the land in safety. And the land will yield her fruit, and ye shall eat your fill and dwell therein in safety. So early on in the law, it's clearly given as a promise to them that if you follow my statutes and obey me, then you'll dwell in safety and the land will produce for you and it will be a beautiful thing. So the next one is Deuteronomy 12. If you just flick over there a few pages to there, we see the same idea again. As they're about to head in, Moses says to them, verse 10, but when ye go over Jordan and dwell in the land which the Lord your God gives you to inherit, and there he gives you rest from all your enemies round about, so that ye dwell in safety, then there shall be a place which the Lord your God shall choose to cause his name to dwell. So once again, they go into the land God's given them to inherit, and they get rest from all of their enemies. Now, we'll pick one more from Deuteronomy. This one's from chapter 33, so towards the end of the book now. This is part of the blessings of the tribes, and it says, verse 11, bless Lord his substance, accept the work of his hands, smite through the loins of them that rise against him, and of them that hate him, that they rise not again. So your enemies that rise up against you will be smitten down so they can't rise. And it goes on, and of Benjamin he said, the beloved of the Lord shall dwell in safety by him, and the Lord shall cover him all the day long, and shall dwell between his shoulders. Now, the last two we don't need to look up because I'm pretty sure you'll be familiar with them. I'll read them to you. Psalm 4 verse 8 is that beautiful piece where the psalmist says, I will both lay me down in peace and sleep, For you, Lord, only make me dwell in safety. And then there are a heap of quotes. I've only chosen 5 because it's a nice, neat handful of a number. But this was quite cool from Proverbs 1 verse 33. But whoso hearkens unto me shall dwell safely and shall be quiet from fear of evil. That wisdom is exactly what Leviticus and Deuteronomy are talking about. If you obey God, if you hearken unto him, the Old Testament, the Torah, it says you will dwell safely and you'll prosper. So there's heaps and heaps of other references, obviously, but I just wanted to put up 5 that show us that this was a promise early on to Israel that eventually one day they'll reach this state. Now there's another great word picture that we'll all be familiar with that we probably think about, which is every man dwelling under his vine and his fig tree. And this occurs, I was actually surprised it only occurs 3 times because it feels like such a classic saying. So here's the 4 times it occurs, and I'll just read these passages to you as well. So the first one in 1 Kings 4, verse 24 and 25 is talking about Solomon. And it says, he had dominion over all the region on this side of the river, from Tipsar even to Azar, over all the kings on this side of the river. And he had peace on all sides round about him. And Judah and Israel dwelt safely, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, from Dan even to Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. So there we have truth that it can actually happen. We have this beautiful picture. It's the complete geographic extent from the sea to the river, from Dan to Beersheba. Everyone's dwelling in safety. There's no enemies, all the days of Solomon. So it has happened in the past. And then we have 2 quotes about the future vision. So Micah 4, verse 3 to 4 is this famous quote we know. He shall judge among the people and rebuke strong nations afar off. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. But they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken it. And then that same idea is repeated in Zechariah 3 verse 10. And that day, says the Lord of armies, will you call every man his neighbour under the vine and under the fig tree. So a bit of a whirlwind tour, but there's just 8 quotes of many where it's a clear promise. It has actually happened in the past. It will happen again in the future. It's the promise of obedience to those in Israel, that if you obey and hearken to God, then you will find this state. So it's not a new concept. So having established this, let's now come back to Ezekiel 38, and we're just going to read through 2 verses here to extract some key facts to remind ourselves about when the events of this chapter happened. So let's read verse 8 and verse 11 of Ezekiel 38 once more. After many days you shall be visited. In the latter years you shall come into the land that is brought back from the sword and is gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel, which have always been waste. But is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. And then speaking here in verse 11, you will say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. I will go to them that are at rest, that dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates. So let's just stick up on the screen for a second the key points that we get from this passage. So first of all is the when. Whenever this event happens, it happens after many days, long past the time of Ezekiel, who was about BC 593. When, again, we're told it's in the latter years. And who does it happen to? It's to a land brought back from the sword and gathered. So we understand it has to be post AD 70, when Rome completely obliterated Jerusalem and scattered them around. Where does this event happen? Well, it's in the mountains of Israel, and it's in a place that's described as a land of unwalled villages, which is a bit of a conundrum for us that we'll loop back to at the end of the class. What are these people doing? Well, they're at rest, they're dwelling safely, and how are they doing that? They're without walls, neither gates nor bars. Again, a bit of a conundrum for anyone that knows what Israel looks like today. So without digging too much deeper than this, because we just wanted a superficial reminder of the key stats, we can surmise the following. This Gogian or northern invasion of Israel occurs many days and in the latter years following Ezekiel's prophecy. It must happen after Israel have been brought back into their land and are said to be dwelling in the mountains of Israel. It's at a time in their history when they can be described as a land of unwalled villages where the citizens are living at rest and dwelling safely. So at a superficial look, it seems to be a fairly straightforward set of circumstances that need to be met before any Gogian invasion can commence. Now, here's a question for you which I grappled with for a while. Does that mean Christadelphians are waiting for proper peace to settle in Israel before these events subsequent to Christ's return can commence? Now, don't raise your hand or anything, but if you take a superficial thinking of those facts as is, consider these two statements and whether they are both true. The nation of Israel must be in a state of peace before Christ returns, and Christ's return is imminent. Now, I think for a long time, some Christadelphians, certainly me, thought both those statements were absolutely correct, and that can create an obvious difficulty which we'll explore in a moment. When you think about the historical position of Israel since 1948. Now, what we're going to do now is dive in and actually look at Israel's history of peace treaties. And you'll see why, and you'll see the relevance to why I mentioned I first did this talk in 2021. But before I do that, I just want to mention something about confirmation bias. There's an important approach to follow, particularly in science, when you're testing a theory that you hold to be universal or absolutely true. And what you do is you look for ways in which your theory is wrong. You don't look for ways in which it is right, because you will just end up collecting evidence that suits your agenda. You look for ways your theory is wrong, and you're constantly trying to prove your theory wrong. And if it is, then that's fine, and you can revisit your theory, you can return to the drawing board, rather than looking for things that prove it right. And that's how the great theory, the universal theories such as general relativity, which explains gravity, but that's how great theories like that are tested and ratified. So even today, scientists are trying to prove Einstein's theory wrong, because that's how you build a robust theory. And the reason I think that's interesting is that certainly, I've done it a lot, I know. It's possible sometimes as a Christadelphian to have the theory and then go looking for the evidence that suits your theory. And that's where we end up with a bit of confirmation bias. Now, you might wonder, why do I mention this? Well, in our case, it could be possible to cherry pick a few bits of evidence that suggest that Israel is living in peace, or that they're moving towards peace. Because when I read Ezekiel 38, it told me Israel would be living peacefully. And so I've got to go looking for some evidence, because if you look for it, you will find it. And I'll give you an example now. Let's consider Israel's peace treaties. Now, bearing in mind again, this was first given in early 2021. It doesn't take long to research Israel's history of peace treaties, because there's not many of them. So here they are. So Israel and Egypt signed a peace treaty on the 26th of March 1979, so I wasn't yet born. And then Israel and Jordan signed a peace treaty on the 26th of October 1994. And then, of course, what was the next one? Does anyone know? Very good, the Abraham Accords. So then in mid to late 2020, we suddenly had this burst of activity, and it's hugely exciting. When you really think about this, up until 2020, only 2 countries in the past 46 years had signed peace agreements with Israel to normalise relations. And then in the space of 5 months, that figure trebled. And it was extremely exciting, and it was the talk of Christadelphian circles, as it should be, as any event regarding Israel should be. So does that mean that we can start quoting Ezekiel 38? Look, peace! This is incredible. It's finally happening, and we can get really excited about it. Well, we need to carefully think about all the possible evidence available to us, not just peace treaties. One of the ways we can do that is we can look at Israel's peace treaties, and then we can look at a list of major conflicts. Now, a major conflict is like a war or a military action, so typically it's given a code name. So that's a good way to sort of distinguish between normal violence, which happens a lot, and then an actual military event. So that's what I did. I went through and I charted, now you're not expected to be able to read that, you just have to take it as trust that I haven't made these up. You can come and look at them closer if you like. But what I did is I went through the wars and large-scale military operations since 1948. So it kicks off with the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. I can barely read it myself just from here. So as you can see, there's a lot going on. I actually had it in my notes, but I've deleted it, so I'll have to lean over and peek. But what was particularly interesting to me when I gave this talk in early 2021 is that there had been a dearth of military action since 2014. And then suddenly we had all these peace treaties. And I was like, this is it. This is the peace that Ezekiel talks about. And so it actually finished up with Operation Protective Edge in 2014 was the Gaza War. And when that stopped, there was basically no other major conflict, which is really quite incredible. Now, you could start thinking that peace has arrived in Israel. Now, that actually changed about 2 weeks before I gave the talk. So on the 23rd of April 2021, there were 36 rockets fired at southern Israel, and that kicked off what was known as the 2021 Israel-Palestine crisis, and it all burst to life again. Since then, we've seen the situation deteriorate even further. We've had the tragic southern Israel terrorist attacks of 7th of October 2023 and all the violent conflicts that have followed thereafter, which in recent times have stretched into all-out war. Now, here's what happens when I update the chart as of today. That apparent lull from 2015 to 2020 is forgotten, and since then we've had the 2021 Israel-Palestine crisis in Gaza, which went just for 1 month in May. We had the 2023 Gaza War, Operation Iron Swords, which is ongoing. So that was Israel's reaction to the terrorist attack down south. We've had the 2023 Israel-Hezbollah conflict, Operation Northern Arrows. They went from October 23 to Feb 25. There's the 2024 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, where they've really tried to curtail Hezbollah's activities. That's Operation Iron Arrows, September 24 to present. You may not have actually, maybe you did see a lot of news about it, but you may not have realised just how much Israel has achieved in Lebanon, given everything else that's been going on and all the focus on Gaza. There's been the 2025 southern Syria clashes. They were airstrikes only. They went from April of this year to May of this year, and then they restarted just last month again. And then there's been the 2025 Iran-Israel war, which is Operation Rising Lion, which is obviously ongoing. So Israel hasn't really had much peace at all, is the moral of the story. But even were we to dive into that white box on the screen, where they seemed to dwell at peace, actually we can very easily prove that wasn't the case at all. And this was a large thrust of the first time I did this talk, because I really wanted to make that clear to people that peace has not come. Let's not be lulled into it. It's not a peaceful place. I can probably skim through a lot of this because I think that the chart now updated proves the point. But what's really interesting is that actually during 2015 to 2020, it still was not a peaceful place to live at all. Now, there's several ways we can look at this. The first is rocket attacks, and there's all sorts of interesting charts out there. There's actually, my Australian internet server won't let me visit it anymore, but there was a website called Israel has been rocket-free for ... And it was an online clock that counted down from, counted up every time there's a rocket attack, it reset to 0. And the founder, Aaron Friedman, said this in 2014. Israel has been under non-stop rocket attacks for years, and in the past few weeks, it's gotten worse. And I want people to know what that really means, Friedman wrote on his Facebook feed. So, with the help of Yehonatan Tisrolanik, we developed a site which counts up from the last rocket attack. Whenever a rocket is fired, it restarts. Sadly, this counter never really gets above 1 hour. Now, there's a lot of information out here. One of them, the Jewish Virtual Library, is a really interesting one to go to. I will bother doing it. I'll get to that later. I have a PDF which I made of the website, and it lists all the rocket attacks. They actually go down to individual rocket attacks, and I think there's about 45 pages just scrolling through for ages, going through every single rocket attack. It's quite astonishing. 45 pages in that. Now, this chart is the rockets fired per year from Gaza towards Israel. So if you can't read that, which I can't either, it goes up to 2024. This information is from data according to the Israel Defense Forces and the Israel Security Agency. Now, there was a drop-off in 2015 to 2017. That's where the chart drops right down. But it all started afresh in 2018, and it does seem like the COVID pandemic helped a little bit. There were only 133 rockets fired in 2020. But by 2021, Israel's enemies were making up for lost time. And by 2023, it was the worst year on record. Now, that chart isn't all rockets, that's just rockets fired from Gaza, the modern-day Philistines, I suppose we could say. This chart is from the Mideast Journal, and it's all rockets. You'll see a similar pattern in terms of the bars, but the numbers have shot right up. So Gaza was, in 2023, responsible for 7,500 rockets, and altogether they had 12,000 fired at them. As of today, if you go and look at the rocket data for sort of June, there's pretty much one rocket gets fired a day from Yemen, as well as a bunch of others from Gaza and Syria and so on. But Yemen, being quite far away, seem to sort of wake up, fire their rocket and get on with their day. Now, the rocket attacks became such a constant threat to the Israeli way of life that, of course, they developed the Iron Dome system, which if you haven't looked into, you should, because it's really fascinating. But this helpful BBC infographic explains how it works. It is effectively the enemy rocket gets fired. There's a radar system which detects those rockets. There's then a control system which tracks them for a while and determines where they're going to land. And so if they're going to land somewhere that's not going to cause maximum damage, then they let them land, because you don't want to fire a rocket out unnecessarily, as we'll see in a minute. There's also a battery interceptor system, and that's what they fire at the rocket if they deem that its trajectory is going to be dangerous. So it's a really quite astonishing system. So Iron Dome was declared operational on the 27th of March 2011 near Beersheba, and within 2 weeks it proved its use. It shot down its first rocket from Gaza on the 7th of April 2011. By November 2012, official statements said they'd shot down over 400 rockets, and by 2014 it had intercepted 1,200 rockets. Now, to give you an idea of the running costs of this sort of thing, if you think your mortgage is bad, each launcher battery, so each of those, the piece of artillery on the right-hand side of that chart that actually fires the rockets, they're US 50 million each. Just one of those. Each missile is US $40,000. That's why the second system you can see is the radar system that, the third system, the radar tracks it, and then the third system determines the impact point. That's why they're not firing every single rocket down, because they don't want to spend 40K a pop if it's going to land in a field. So from 2011 to 2021, the United States contributed a total of US $1.6 billion to maintaining the Iron Dome defense system, so upgrading the rocket batteries as well as providing lots and lots of rockets. They provided another US $1 billion. Congress signed that off in 2022. And last April in 2024, the US expanded their support under a new aid package that was also, again, had to be approved by Congress. That aid amount was for $8.7 billion, and the ministry said of that 8.7, $5.2 billion was to strengthen Israel's air and missile defense system, including the Iron Dome, and a new system they're developing called David's Sling. And they've also got a laser defense system in advanced stages of development. So it's a very effective system, but at 40,000 US dollars a pop per missile, it's an expensive one to maintain. Now, 1 month after I did this talk at Punchbowl, the IDF Twitter account posted this. Hamas and Islamic Jihad have fired 3,100 rockets from Gaza in the past 7 days. Now, bear in mind, normally they'd fire sort of 3,000 a year. In a really bad year, they'd fire 7,000 or 7,500. They fired 3,100 in a week. That's the highest daily rate of rocket fire Israel has faced in the history of the country. The threat is real. Millions of Israelis are living under fire. We will continue to defend ourselves. So that's rockets. Now, there's lots of other information I could go through. I won't, but you could look at terrorist deaths. So terrorist deaths are different from just sort of normal everyday violence. This is actual specific events. On average, 176 people die in Israel every year from terrorism. That data is skewed because of that terrible event in 2021. But even if we even if we took that out and pretended that the October 7 event didn't happen, 27 people a year still die from terrorist attacks in Israel. Now, that's not including another data source, which is Israeli-Palestinian violence. These are the Wikipedia pages I have. So you can go on per year and look at the Israeli-Palestinian violence. So that's stabbings in shopping malls and things like that. And there's, on some years, like I think it's 2018, there's almost an entry a day. And to PDF the page, you get 40 or 50 pages when you scroll through all the things that happen. The moral of the story being that even during that lull of 2015 to 2020, when you consider wars and military conflicts from 1948 to 25, rockets and mortar attacks from 2005 to 2025, terrorist attacks from just 2015 to 24, and Israeli-Palestinian violence over the last 5 years, no reasonable person could ever allege that Israel at any time in their modern history has dwelled in safely, lived safely without fear of an enemy. Now let's go back and think then what Ezekiel 38 is talking about. Now, firstly, who's being spoken to here in verse 8? Who's the thou of verse 8? After many days, thou shalt be visited. Well, it's Gog, verse 3, because that's who's being spoken to. Thee, thy, thine in verse 4, be thou prepared, thy company, thee, all of this dialogue at the beginning, this is Gog that's being addressed, and it's important for us to remember. Secondly, how are Israel described? Well, we looked at that earlier. They're brought back from the sword, they're brought out of the nations, they're dwelling safely in a land of unwalled villages, at rest and so on. So here's the key and critical issue for this afternoon. What does safely actually mean? Now here we can stick up the Hebrew word, which is H983, batar. And if you remember nothing else from today apart from lots of rockets, I'd like you to remember H983. It's the Hebrew word batar. Now here's what Gesenius says about this word. It means, number one, confidence, and confidently with confident mind. And he uses Genesis as an example, which we'll see in a minute. It means, secondly, security. In other places, without danger and fear, or safely, to dwell safely. It can also mean without fear as in securely. Here's a really interesting line which is in the middle of that box. Sometimes used of one who is in too great security and without caution. And then finally, it's the name of a town in Syria. So I guess if there's one thing you take away and remember from this first study today, or to note in your margin, it's that the Hebrew word batar, appearing in our English Bible, most commonly as safety, has two very different usages. The first is exactly what we'd expect to see. It means dwelling safely, not having any fear of enemy. And in fact, that's the word that appears in those first 5 verses that we looked up. Leviticus 25, Deuteronomy, Psalms, and Proverbs. But Gesenius, Strong's, and other lexicons show us there's a very different meaning of this word as well. And in the context, it can mean something quite different. Now, to get this across, we're going to look up a few of these verses, but I have got them on the screen. Probably here's the examples of them dwelling at rest that we mentioned earlier. But I'd like us to actually, we have time, so I'd like us to look up these passages and we'll get a real sense of the same word that appears in Ezekiel 38. Now look at how else it is used in Scripture. So our first one is the one Gesenius uses. I'm getting mixed up with my words here. Genesis 34, verse 25, as quoted by Gesenius. And we know this chapter is the terrible incident of Shechem. Now, without going into the gory detail too much, the Shechemites thought that they'd found a friend, and they thought they'd made a covenant, and they felt safe at last because they'd made a covenant with this new powerful tribe, and they'd gone through their painful end of the deal, and they were sitting around waiting for things to get better. And unfortunately, as we know in verse 25, it came to pass on the third day when they saw that 2 of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brethren, took each man his sword and came upon the city Batar and slew all the males. They came upon the city boldly. So here, Batar doesn't mean safely at all. It means confidently. Now, of course, they came upon the city confidently because they'd incapacitated all of its fighting men. So only 2 of them were required to take out a whole city. So here, this word clearly means boldly, with assurance, confidence. That's what we get from Batar. Right, come over to Judges 8, verse 11. because we see this again. The next two quotes are actually both from Judges. So Judges 8 verse 11, this is talking about Gideon. We read verse 11, Gideon went up by the way of them that dwelt in the tents of the east of Nobar and Jogbehar, and smote the host, for the host was secure. Now, when you read that in English, it doesn't make sense. He smote the host because they were secure. You think, that doesn't make sense to me at all. If they were secure, surely he wouldn't have been able to fight them. What it means is he smote them because they were batar. They were confident. They were so confident that they thought, that Gideon bloke's never going to harm us. And so he came upon them. So in this context, batar means so confident that you're unsuspecting, that maybe you're a bit careless. In fact, if you read the NIV, it says Gideon attacked the unsuspecting army. And if you look up the ESV, it says he attacked the army, for the army felt secure. Now, it seems to be a bit of a theme in Judges, unsuspecting armies. Come over to chapter 18, verse 7 and 10. This is where the spies of Dan are heading out, and it says, the 5 men, verse 7, departed and came to Laish and saw the people that were therein, how they dwelt carelessly after the manner of the Zidonians, quiet and secure. And there was no magistrate in the land that might put them to shame in anything, for they were far from the Zidonians, and they had no business with any man. So these people dwelt batar. Also verse 11. Was it verse 11? No, verse 10, sorry. When ye go, ye shall come upon a people batar, secure, into a large land, for God has given it into your hands. So these people aren't actually secure. God's saying, I've given it over to you, and you're going to find a batar people. They are so confident because they live miles away from anyone. They don't deal with anyone else, verse 7, and so it's going to be easy pickings, says God. So in this context, batar again means unsuspecting or unawares. Well, let's come now to some wisdom passages and see how it holds up there. Proverbs chapter 3 is our next stop. Proverbs 3 verse 29. This one says, devise not evil against your neighbour, seeing he dwells securely by you. Now, the ESV and the NIV say trustingly. In other words, this neighbour would never expect to receive evil from your hand. He's your neighbour, and you're his neighbour, and you're his friend. So don't devise evil against him, because he'd never suspect you. He's not on guard against you. So batar again means unsuspecting or unawares. Now, probably my favourite one is the next one, Isaiah 47. This is the downfall of Babylon. Now, if you ever want a powerful, like all-powerful, mighty nation, you've got Babylon here. And Isaiah 47, verse 5 and 8. Sit thou silent, and get you into darkness, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for you shall no more be called the Lady of Kingdoms. Verse 8, therefore, hear now this, you that are given to pleasures, that dwell batar, that dwell carelessly, that say in your heart, I am, and there's no one else beside me. I shall not sit as a widow, neither shall I know the loss of children. But these two things are going to happen to you, says God. You're just going to be taken away. You are so confident and arrogant and unsuspecting that your day is going to come upon you and you're not going to know anything like it, because you're sitting there going, I'm the one and no one else can compare to me. That is just a great example of what batar means. Careless, unsuspecting. In this case, because you're arrogant. You don't need anyone else. You trust in your own arm. Well, there's another great one in prophecy, Jeremiah 49. Now, all of these next ones are all from prophecy, which I think is interesting when you read Ezekiel 38. You should remember that. Jeremiah 49 is our next stop, and verse 31. This is Nebuchadnezzar, and he's told by God to attack Hazor. Verse 31, arise, get you up to that wealthy nation that dwells batar without care, says Yahweh, which have neither gates nor bars. Now that's interesting, isn't it? When they excavated Hazor, they found lots of gates and bars. It's not literal. It's saying they dwell as if they don't need them because they're so confident in themselves. In fact, Hazor had impressive gates and bars and walls. But God says to Nebuchadnezzar, go and attack that city because they dwell carelessly. All right, well, let's jump over to Ezekiel himself now, and we'll go first of all to chapter 30, Ezekiel 30, verse 9. So here we have judgment pronounced upon Egypt and our allies. And it says, In that day shall messengers go forth from me in ships to make the Betar Ethiopians afraid, and great pain shall come upon them, as in the day of Egypt, for lo it comes. Now, of course, the King James says careless, but it is the Hebrew word Betar. The NIV says, messengers shall go to frighten Cush out of her complacency, which is a great word. The ESV says, messengers shall come to terrify the unsuspecting people of Cush. So Betar means careless, complacent, unsuspecting. Now, we'll come one chapter after today's reading. So let's come to Ezekiel 39, verse 6. This is where judgment is pronounced upon Magog. It says, I will send a fire. Do you notice these are all about judgment? These are nearly always in the context of an attack. I will send a fire on Magog and upon them that dwell the Betar in the isles carelessly, and they shall know that I am the Lord. So the ESV says, those who dwell securely in the coastlands. So in this context, Betar is again careless, secure, unaware of coming judgment. Now, two more and we'll finish here. Micah chapter 2, verse 8. I can never find Micah in my Bible. Here we go. Micah 2, verse 8. Even of late, my people is risen up as an enemy. You pull off the robe with the garment from them that pass by securely, as men adverse from war. Now that verse doesn't help us at all. It's very confusing. What's being spoken about here? The King James feels a bit misleading, but what it's talking about is that about people who grab the garment off someone who pass by securely as men adverse from war. The ESV is a lot easier to understand. It says, you strip the rich robe from those who pass by trustingly with no thought of war. So here Betar is unsuspecting or trusting. You've been taken advantage of. It's a little bit like that quote in Proverbs which said don't hurt your unsuspecting neighbour. And then lastly, we'll look at Zephaniah chapter 2, another almost impossible book to find. I'm going to have to read this one from my notes. I don't think I have Zephaniah in this Bible. No, I don't. All right, judgment is being passed upon Nineveh. Like the daughter of Babylon in Isaiah 47, Nineveh is the rejoicing city that dwells carelessly, Betar, that says in her heart, I am, and there is none like me. The ESV for this verse says this is the exultant city that lived securely. And yet as that passage shows, she's actually laid desolate and becomes a public warning to others. So forgive me for labouring the point, but there we have at least 10 occasions where the word safely or Betar occurs, and it does not refer to the idea of rest. It refers instead to this broader idea of confidence, boldness, security, even to the point that you might be unsuspecting or careless or arrogant. And we get that, again, as we said, if we come to Gesenius and we see the meanings that he provided. Now, I believe this lends a credible biblical alternative to our reading of Ezekiel 38. If you have an authorised version, you'll notice that against some of those words that the translators have inexplicably chosen as safely, you actually have a little 2 that says confidently. So even the translators recognised we use confidently or securely or unaware in chapter 30 and in chapter 39, and maybe that's what we should have used in 38. So they've popped it in your margin there. Now, this really makes sense to me. It's not hard to understand that considering Israel has the IDF, the Mossad, the Iron Dome, David's sling, the laser system, the financial backing of the world's largest superpower, it's not hard for me to understand how they can be seen to be dwelling in confidence, putting their trust in the strength of their own arm, rather in God's hand that invisibly overlooks them. Now, if any of you were at the April Bible School at Rathmines, you may recall an anecdote that Brother John Owen shared. He wrote how Israel responded to some Christadelphian well-wishers. There was a group of brethren in the US, and they wrote to Benjamin Netanyahu in the wake of the October 7 Hamas attacks. And they wrote and said, God loves Israel, we love Israel, and we're praying for Israel. And the brethren were very excited to receive a letter back from the office of Benjamin Netanyahu. And they opened it up and they pulled it out with excitement and they stood around and read this letter together. And the letter said, Israel doesn't need your prayers, which I thought was just astonishing. That just about says it all, doesn't it? So that's a suggestion with, I think, clear biblical precedents that Israel is not dwelling in safety when Gog comes. They're dwelling confidently, securely, almost arrogantly, almost carelessly. like all of those other examples we saw. But that leaves us with one last challenging question. What about all these unwalled villages? This certainly presents a conundrum for anyone that has seen pictures of Israel or been there. Now, two simple points to consider here. Firstly, rich figurative language is used all through this chapter. Consider, I'll put hooks in your jaws, verse 4. There's going to be an army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with great armour. You will ascend and come like a storm. You'll be like a cloud to cover the land. Riding on horses, a great army. And then it talks about the fish of the sea, the creeping things, the fowls of the air fleeing away. So with that in mind, we need to read the chapter consistently. We can't read horses and horsemen like a cloud, swords and shields as figurative, but then when we get to unwalled bars and unwalled villages and no bars and gates and expect that to be literal. It's either all figurative language or all literal. You can't mix and match in the space of a verse. So we have to be consistent about it. Otherwise, I might insist that everything is figurative, but that a literal cloud is going to attack the land. Or I might understand that everything is figurative, except the horses are literal, and there's not going to be an army of tanks come down. They're actually going to come on horses, because that part's literal. So I need to be consistent in my application of it. So if the horses are symbolic for tanks and other things, then the unwalled bars and the unwalled villages, it's very hard to say. I've forgotten the order now, but that's got to be figurative too. Secondly, the more important point to me is who is talking here? When we read about them dwelling in unwalled villages without bars and gates, it's the attacker talking. It's the perspective of the attacker. It's not an actual description of them, just like Hazor. Hazor had gates and bars and everything, and this is the attacker speaking. They're saying Israel are easy pickings. They're so confident, like all those 10 quotes we looked up, they're so confident we're going to catch them unawares. So for me, it doesn't require the removal of every bar and gate and wall in Israel. It's figurative language, and it's the perspective of the attacker. So let's summarise what we've considered in 4 points. Ever since the beginning of Scripture, from Genesis through the rest of the Torah and the Old Testament, it's been the hope of Israel to dwell in safety in their land. Modern history reveals this hope has not been within grasp of the Israeli people at any time in their years since 1948. They've been in a constant near state of war and conflict. However, a close examination of that Hebrew word batah, I've forgotten the number now, 983, reveals that it means something more than safety, as we've already seen. To me, it's a rather apt description of the modern nation of Israel. They put their trust in the might of their own army, their technology, their secret service, their relationship with the US, their air force, their Iron Dome, their ability to act quickly and with surprise, and ironically, to catch people out unawares. That's what they put their confidence in. And the unwalled villages and bars and gates comment in Ezekiel, firstly is figurative language, and secondly is the perspective of the attacker who thinks they will be easy pickings. Now let's wrap up with what we love, which is a few news headlines and a few things to look out for. Now here's what I'd originally put in 2021. These are a few things that I thought might be interesting to watch. Firstly, Benjamin Netanyahu was under attack from all sides. There's all sorts of corruption charges floating around, and there was a right-wing politician in line to replace him, whose name I've long since forgotten, but that's his picture on the screen. And I thought that was interesting because Benjamin Netanyahu is a hawk. He's a fighter. He's a military man. His brother was killed at Entebbe. When was that? Was that the 80s or even earlier? 79. I wasn't too far off. There you go. Thank you. Before I was born, so I'm off the hook for not knowing it. So his brother was killed in Entebbe. He's a military man, and I thought another right-wing politician with a real hawkish approach to the military would be interesting if Israel are going to continue trusting in themselves and being secure in themselves. I wanted to know what the world's response would be to, at the time, the April 2021 conflict that had burst out in Gaza. Was there going to be even more pressure on Israel to pull back? Were they going to have to become less warlike and more diplomatic in their dealings with that nation? I I also was curious about whether there'd be any sort of resolution to that, but also at the time, Israel had put forward a formal response, Israel had put forward a request for funding for the Iron Dome, and of course this was coming out of COVID, world economies were in absolute meltdown, debt was ballooning already, so I was sort of curious what's going to happen there. Like, are the Democrats, as they come into power, are they going to continue funding this? What's going to happen? So what happened with these developments? Well, in a nutshell, here's what we saw. There was no right-wing politician that replaced Bibi. He's still in power. What was the world's response? Well, we had the most pro-Israeli US president come back into the White House. In terms of the resolution to Gaza, the only resolution has really been in Israel's favour. They've bulldozed most of Gaza, they've destroyed the Hamas leadership, and they remain in open war with Iran. And what was the response to the funding? Well, the formal funding, as I alluded to earlier in the talk, was approved. There was 8.7 billion earmarks for Israel, of which 5.9 or 5.2 was for the Iron Dome, David Sling and the laser system. So Israel and the US really doubled down on their financial commitment to the Iron Dome. And actually, at the time, the very day that I was updating these slides, I read this in the Australian newspaper. It said, Israel approves plan to occupy Gaza and to clear the population. So they're really, in their terms, making hay while the sun shines, clearing out their enemies. Now, that was my May update. So much has happened since then, as you know, that I was struggling to think about how to update this study without taking another hour or so. So I'm going to do it in 2 minutes. And I decided the best way to do it would be to throw a few headlines on the screen. And the first 3 are all from the same publication, because I wanted you to see how quickly perspectives can change on things. So these first 3 headlines are all from the Australian Financial Review, the AFR, and I'll just read the headline and the tagline. This is from December 28, 2023. Doubts over Israel's ability to destroy Hamas grow. Israel has vowed to dismantle the group responsible for the bloody October 7 attack, but critics say that goal is unrealistic. It's a lot bigger when you're right up close, as I realise now. All right, well, the AFR updated their position. This is from March 14, so 2.5 months on from when they wrote that last article. Hamas has been shattered. Now it is fighting to survive. Israel has yet to achieve all its wartime goals, but for Hamas, an Islamist militant group founded to destroy the Jewish state, victory now has largely narrowed to one thing: survival. This one was from last week, July the 25th. Hamas running out of money as aid trade dries up. The military wing is struggling to pay fighters, while the Gaza government, that the terrorist group has long run, is cutting services and salaries for police and military employees. So even the AFR did quite an arc on their view on Israel's ability to really cut down Hamas, who have been in power in Gaza for so long. Across, basically from December to July, they realised, oh no, that goal is a lot more realistic than we realised. Well, a few others. This is from the 27th of July, so last week again. So 2 Hezbollah members killed in an Israeli drone strike. Now, if you haven't, because of everything that's happening in Gaza, perhaps we're not as aware of the great inroads that Israel has made against Hezbollah, which is funded by Iran and run out of Lebanon. So a lot has been happening here, and as of last week, they're still going after the members. This is from Wednesday the 18th of June. Donald Trump demands Iran's surrender and says US will not kill Supreme Leader for now, which is sort of his idea of a good deal, I suppose. These headlines are just unthinkable. Like, for so long, Israel have been trying to get in front of the UN to make people aware of what they're coming under, the threats they're under from, say, Gaza and from Hezbollah, and how it was all funded by Iran. And for the world's largest military to now be openly calling for the surrender of Iran, it's just incredible. Like, I bet the Israelis couldn't believe this would be the case going back a year or two. They're just in a totally different position now. And you can see that arrogance and confidence come out, because we're sort of not surprised when Donald Trump says stuff like that. But then Israel came out. This is from, again, July 27. Israeli defense minister threatens to assassinate Iran's supreme leader and attacks Tehran. That is just, if you know anything about the world of diplomacy. That is just mind-boggling that they can even come out and say that, and that they're in the position where they can say that sort of thing. This is just a nation at the cutting edge of confidence. They have nothing to fear because they've crippled Gaza. Let's not rejoice over that, in that it is a tragedy for the people that are there. But from an Israeli security point of view, to have cleared out Hamas, to have weakened them to the point that they can't pay their fighters, they can't pay their firefighters or their policemen, to have attacked Hezbollah and chopped that leadership off, and to have gutted the Iranian military leadership, is just, they're in an incredible position. And now you have something like this from the New York Times. How tough is Iran? A string of military losses raises questions. So Israel dwelling in safety, what does Ezekiel really mean? Well, I hope you can see, and I'm not dogmatic at all, but I really think that actually what Ezekiel's saying to us is in line with much of the other references in the Old Testament. Israel is dwelling in confidence. So let's remain watchful and excited about God's hand continuing to work, because we see Israel dwelling in exactly the state now. It's not like we have to wait for peace to break out, something that's never happened in 70 years. We don't have to wait for that to happen. Israel are already dwelling in the state in which Ezekiel seems to describe when the Gogian invasion commences, because they're caught unawares. And the day is coming when that northern invader, the one they least expect, will arouse himself from his slumber, and he will come like a storm cloud upon the land. And then at the moment of greatest calamity, that's when they realise it's the Rock of Israel upon whom they must depend. It's the rejected Messiah who's going to appear to save them and to take his people unto himself. And so we continue to prepare ourselves for that day as well.
Don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a comment in the comment section and let us know what you thought. And make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Please share it and spread the word. Thanks for watching, and remember to come back soon.